It was a quiet morning at Greenfield Academy, the kind of day when the sun streamed softly through the classroom windows, promising a peaceful routine. The bell had just rung, and students were shuffling into their seats, settling in for another day of lessons. Among them was Jordan, a bright yet reserved boy with a passion for reading and an uncanny ability to solve puzzles. He wasn't the loudest in the class or the first to raise his hand, but those who knew him recognized his quiet brilliance. Jordan carried himself with a certain humility, though his sharp mind and kind nature stood out to those who took the time to notice. But not everyone noticed. Miss Henderson, the strict and sharp-tongued math teacher, prided herself on running the most disciplined classroom in the school. To her, academic success came from obedience and order, and she was known for her unforgiving nature. She had a way of picking out weaknesses in her students and honing in on them, believing it was her responsibility to push them toward improvement. However, her methods often left students feeling more defeated than motivated, and today her attention had turned to Jordan. As the lesson began, Miss Henderson called on students to solve equations on the board. Jordan, quietly working through his notes, hadn't realized it was his turn. "Jordan," she snapped, her voice cutting through the silence like a whip. "Are you even paying attention? Get up here and show the class how to solve this." Startled, Jordan quickly rose from his seat and made his way to the front of the room. He could feel the weight of his classmates' eyes on him as he stared at the complicated equation Miss Henderson had written on the board. His mind raced, but the pressure of the moment made it hard to think. After a few long seconds of silence, Miss Henderson crossed her arms, her lips curling into a smirk. "Well," she said, her tone dripping with impatience, "do you even know where to start?" Jordan hesitated, his hands still frozen in midair, as he tried to piece together the solution in his head. The classroom felt impossibly silent, the kind of silence that makes every little sound, every shuffle, every cough seem amplified. His palms were clammy, and he could feel the heat rising to his face. He wanted nothing more than to get this over with, to return to the relative safety of his desk, but his mind just wasn't cooperating. Miss Henderson's voice broke through the silence, sharp and cutting. "This is basic algebra, Jordan. Didn't you study? Or do you just expect to coast through this class without putting in any effort?" The words stung. Jordan wasn't one to slack off. He spent hours after school going through his books, often asking questions when he didn't understand. Math wasn't his strongest subject, but he tried his best to keep up. The problem wasn't that he didn't care or wasn't prepared. It was that moments like this, under the weight of everyone's judgment, made it nearly impossible to focus. The classroom began to buzz softly with murmurs, a few stifled giggles here and there. Some of his classmates looked away, uncomfortable with the tension, while others whispered to one another, clearly entertained by Jordan's struggle. "Speak up." Miss Henderson's voice was louder now, commanding attention. "If you can't solve this, then maybe you don't belong in this class. We're here to learn, not waste time waiting for someone who isn't prepared." Jordan's hand trembled as he picked up the chalk, trying to piece together a solution just to end this moment. His movements were slow, tentative, as though he was second-guessing every step. But before he could make any progress, Miss Henderson sighed dramatically and snatched the chalk from his hand. "This is pathetic," she said, turning back to the class. "Everyone, take a good look. This is what happens when you don't take your education seriously." Her words felt like a slap, and Jordan's face burned with humiliation. He wanted to sink into the floor, to disappear entirely. She turned back to him, her tone icy now. "Go sit down. Maybe if you actually tried for once, you'd be able to keep up. You're holding this class back." Jordan shuffled back to his seat, his head down, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He didn't trust himself to look up, not even at his friends. He could feel their pity, and in some ways, that felt worse than the laughter. He slumped into his chair, staring at the blank page in his notebook, his mind replaying the moment over and over again. The rest of the class passed in a blur. Jordan couldn't concentrate on anything Miss Henderson said, nor did he want to. His thoughts were consumed by the weight of her words. The way she had singled him out made him feel so small in front of everyone. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. Most teachers liked him, even if he wasn't at the top of the class. He was polite, hardworking, and stayed out of trouble. But with Miss Henderson, it felt like nothing he did was ever good enough. When the bell finally rang, Jordan packed up his things as quickly as possible, avoiding eye contact with everyone around him. He was one of the last to leave the room, walking slowly toward the hallway, hoping to avoid the crowd. But just as he reached the door, Miss Henderson called out to him. "Jordan," she said sharply, "a word." He stopped in his tracks, his stomach sinking. Turning back, he saw her standing by her desk, her arms crossed. Her expression was unreadable, but it was clear she wasn't about to offer an apology. "You need to shape up," she said, her tone firm but not as loud as before. "I've seen students like you before, bright but lazy. You have potential, Jordan, but if you keep coasting like this, you're going to fail. And if you fail, you'll only have yourself to blame." Jordan didn't say anything. He didn't trust himself to. He just nodded stiffly and left the room, her words echoing in his mind. Bright but lazy. Was that how she saw him? Was that how everyone saw him? He didn't understand why she was so hard on him, why she seemed to go out of her way to single him out. It wasn't fair, and it wasn't right. By the time he got home that afternoon, Jordan was exhausted, not physically, but emotionally. He dropped his bag by the door and went straight to his room, shutting the door behind him. He didn't want to talk to anyone, not even his mom, who was usually the first person he turned to when something was bothering him. But his mom, Natalie, wasn't someone who missed much. She had an uncanny ability to sense when something was wrong, and today was no exception. A single mother and a force to be reckoned with, Natalie had always been fiercely protective of Jordan. She had raised him to be respectful, kind, and hardworking, and she knew how much he cared about his education. So when she noticed how quiet he was that evening, she decided to probe gently. "Jordan," she said as they sat down for dinner, her voice soft but firm. "What's going on? You've barely said a word since you got home." He hesitated, poking at his food with his fork. "It's nothing, Mom. Just a rough day at school." "Rough how?" she pressed, her eyes searching his face. "Talk to me. You know you can tell me anything." For a moment, Jordan debated whether or not to tell her. He didn't want to seem like he was complaining or making a big deal out of nothing. But the memory of Miss Henderson's words, the way she had humiliated him, was still fresh in his mind. Finally, he sighed and told her everything about the math lesson, the equation, and the way she had called him out in front of the entire class. As he spoke, Natalie's expression shifted from concern to something much fiercer. She listened intently, her jaw tightening with every word. By the time Jordan finished, she was silent for a moment, as though trying to decide what to say. "Jordan," she began carefully, her voice calm but firm, "no teacher has the right to make you feel that way. You are not lazy, and you are certainly not a failure. You work hard, and you care about your education. I know that, and anyone who takes the time to really see you would know that too." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with uncertainty. But what if she's right? What if I'm not good enough? Natalie reached across the table and took his hand. "Listen to me. You are more than good enough. And no one, not Miss Henderson, not anyone, gets to tell you otherwise. Do you hear me?" Jordan nodded slowly, her words giving him a glimmer of reassurance. But Natalie wasn't done. She had seen too many instances of authority figures abusing their power, and she wasn't about to let this slide. She didn't know exactly how she would handle it yet, but one thing was certain: Miss Henderson had no idea who she was dealing with. As Jordan went to bed that night, Natalie sat down at the kitchen table, her mind racing. She thought about all the times she'd have fought for her son, all the obstacles they have faced together. This was just another challenge, another fight she was willing to take on. Miss Henderson had crossed a line, and Natalie was determined to make her see that. The next morning, Jordan woke up feeling a little lighter after his conversation with his mom, though the thought of facing Miss Henderson again still lingered in the back of his mind. He got ready for school, his routine moving slower than usual, and grabbed his backpack. When he walked into the kitchen, Natalie was already there, her expression calm but focused. She handed him a lunch bag and smiled, her usual warmth breaking through her determined demeanor. "Have a good day, Jordan," she said, her tone kind but carrying an undertone of something else, something more deliberate. He nodded, not wanting to ask what she was planning, and headed out the door. At school, Jordan tried his best to keep his head down. He moved through the hallways quickly, hoping to avoid any unnecessary attention. His friends noticed he was quieter than usual, but they didn't press him. When math class finally rolled around, Jordan felt his stomach twist in knots. He didn't know if Miss Henderson was going to single him out again, but he dreaded the possibility. Miss Henderson walked into the classroom, her usual sharp heels clicking against the floor, and the room immediately fell silent. She began the lesson without so much as a glance in Jordan's direction, which was both a relief and a source of anxiety. He couldn't tell if she was ignoring him intentionally or if he had simply been spared for the day. Either way, he kept his focus on his notebook, quietly working through the problems and avoiding her gaze. But the quiet didn't last long. Halfway through the lesson, Miss Henderson began walking around the classroom, checking students' work. When she reached Jordan's desk, she paused, her expression unreadable. "Jordan," she said, her voice low, but still sharp enough for others nearby to hear. "This is sloppy work. I don't know how you expect to pass this class if you can't even get the basics right." Jordan felt the familiar sting of her words, but this time he said nothing. He simply nodded and kept his eyes on his paper, trying to focus on anything but the growing tension around him. He could hear the whispers of his classmates, the subtle rustle of papers as people pretended not to listen, and it made his chest tighten. By the end of the day, Jordan was exhausted. He wanted nothing more than to go home and forget about the day's events. But when he walked through the front door, he found Natalie sitting on the couch, her laptop open, and a determined look on her face. She looked up as he entered, her expression softening when she saw him. "Hey, sweetheart," she said. "How was school?" Jordan shrugged, dropping his backpack by the door. "It was okay," he said, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. Natalie nodded, not pressing him for more. She closed her laptop and patted the spot next to her on the couch. "Come sit with me for a minute," she said. He hesitated but eventually sat down. Natalie turned to face him, her eyes full of the kind of love and strength that had carried them through so many challenges before. "I've been thinking about what happened yesterday," she said gently, "and I want you to know that I'm not going to let this slide. What your teacher said to you, the way she treated you, that's not okay. No one has the right to make you feel like that." Jordan looked down, unsure of what to say. Part of him felt relieved that his mom was on his side, but another part of him felt nervous. He didn't want to make things worse. "What are you going to do?" he asked quietly. Natalie smiled, but there was a fire in her eyes. "I'm going to have a conversation with Miss Henderson," she said. "And if that doesn't work, I'll take it up with the school administration. This isn't just about you, Jordan. If she's treating you like this, she's probably doing the same to other students. Someone needs to hold her accountable." Jordan nodded, feeling a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. He trusted his mom, but he also couldn't help but worry about how Miss Henderson might react. The next day, Natalie took an extended lunch break from work and headed to the school. She was calm and composed, but there was a certain intensity in her stride as she walked through the front office and asked to speak with Miss Henderson. The receptionist hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure of how to handle the situation, but eventually called the teacher down. When Miss Henderson arrived, she looked slightly surprised to see Natalie waiting for her. The teacher's usual air of authority seemed to falter for just a moment before she straightened her posture and approached with a professional smile. "Mrs. Taylor," Miss Henderson said, extending her hand. "How can I help you?" "It's Miss Taylor," Natalie corrected, shaking her hand firmly. "And I'd like to talk to you about how you've been treating my son." Miss Henderson's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. "Of course," she said, gesturing toward a small meeting room nearby. "Let's step in here." Once inside, Natalie wasted no time getting to the point. She recounted everything Jordan had told her, her voice steady but firm. She didn't raise her voice, but there was no mistaking the intensity of her words. Miss Henderson listened, her expression remaining neutral, but there was a flicker of something, maybe defensiveness, maybe discomfort, in her eyes. "I'm sure you can appreciate the importance of discipline in the classroom," Miss Henderson said when Natalie had finished. "I hold all my students to high standards because I believe they're capable of meeting them. Sometimes that means being firm." "Being firm is one thing," Natalie said, her tone sharp but controlled. "But humiliating a child in front of their peers, that's not discipline, that's bullying, and it's unacceptable." Miss Henderson opened her mouth to respond, but Natalie held up a hand to stop her. "I'm not here to argue," Natalie continued. "I'm here to make sure this doesn't happen again. Not to Jordan, not to any other student. Do I make myself clear?" Miss Henderson hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Of course," she said, though her tone lacked conviction. "I'll be more mindful in the future." Natalie nodded, standing up to leave. "Good," she said, "because if I hear about anything like this happening again, I'll be taking it up with the principal. And trust me, you don't want that." As Natalie walked out of the room, she felt a surge of pride and determination. She had done what she needed to do, and she wasn't going to back down. Miss Henderson, on the other hand, sat alone in the room, her thoughts swirling. She hadn't expected this confrontation, and though she wouldn't admit it, Natalie's words had struck a nerve. Back at home, Jordan listened as his mom recounted the meeting. He felt a mix of relief and admiration for her, though he couldn't shake the feeling that things weren't quite over yet. Miss Henderson might have agreed to back off, but Jordan knew her well enough to know that she wouldn't let go of her pride so easily. As the days passed, things seemed to improve in math class. Miss Henderson no longer singled Jordan out, and he was able to focus on his work without the constant fear of humiliation. But there was still a tension in the air, an unspoken unease that lingered between them. It was as if both of them were waiting for the other to make the next move, though neither was sure what that move would be. Over the next few weeks, Jordan tried to settle back into his routine. For the most part, things in Miss Henderson's class seemed to have calmed down. She was no longer making snide remarks or singling him out in front of the class, and Jordan found himself able to concentrate on his work without feeling like a spotlight was constantly on him. His grades slowly began to improve, and he even started to feel a sense of pride when he solved a particularly tough problem on his own. But despite the outward calm, Jordan couldn't shake the feeling that Miss Henderson's sudden change in behavior wasn't entirely genuine. It felt more like she was holding something back, waiting for the right moment to strike. At home, Natalie was keeping a close eye on her son's progress. She checked in with him daily, asking about his classes and how things were going with Miss Henderson. Jordan tried to assure her that things were better, but Natalie wasn't one to let her guard down so easily. She could sense that something was still off, even if Jordan couldn't quite put it into words. She decided to keep her own quiet watch, ready to step in again if necessary. One afternoon, Jordan came home with a strange look on his face. He dropped his backpack by the door as usual, but instead of heading to the kitchen for a snack, he sat down on the couch and stared at the floor. Natalie noticed immediately and sat down beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" she asked softly. Jordan hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. "It's nothing really," he said, though his tone betrayed his words. "Miss Henderson didn't say anything mean, if that's what you're worried about." Natalie raised an eyebrow, sensing there was more to the story. "Then what is it?" she pressed. "You can tell me." Jordan sighed, finally looking up at her. "It's just, she's acting weird. Like, not mean or anything, but it feels fake. She doesn't talk to me at all now, even when I raise my hand in class. It's like I don't exist. And today, she was talking to another teacher in the hallway, and I overheard her say something about how some parents are too sensitive and how it's making her job harder. Natalie's jaw tightened, though she kept her voice calm. Did she mention you specifically? She asked. Jordan shook his head. No, but it felt like she was talking about you. About us. Natalie leaned back, her mind racing. Miss Henderson's behavior was concerning, but it wasn't outright enough to warrant another confrontation. Still, Natalie couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. She decided to bide her time, knowing that if Miss Henderson was truly up to something, it would only be a matter of time before it became clear. Meanwhile, at school, Miss Henderson had been putting on a front of professionalism. To her colleagues and the principal, she appeared as dedicated and hardworking as ever, but beneath the surface, she was quietly seething. The meeting with Natalie had shaken her more than she cared to admit, and though she had agreed to back off, she felt humiliated by the encounter. She had spent years building her reputation as a no-nonsense teacher who demanded excellence from her students, and in her mind, Natalie's intervention had undermined her authority. Her frustration simmered quietly, manifesting in subtle ways. She ignored Jordan in class, refusing to call on him even when he raised his hand with the right answers. She made pointed comments during staff meetings about how parents needed to trust educators to do their jobs, and how some students need tougher discipline to succeed. Though she never named names, it wasn't hard for those who knew the situation to connect the dots. One day, Miss Henderson decided to assign a group project. She divided the class into pairs, carefully avoiding putting Jordan with any of his close friends. Instead, she paired him with a student who was known for being difficult to work with, someone who rarely contributed and often caused problems. Jordan tried his best to stay positive, but the project quickly became a source of stress. His partner didn't show up for their scheduled work sessions, leaving Jordan to do most of the work on his own. When the day came to present their project, Miss Henderson didn't hold back her criticism. "This is disappointing," she said after their presentation. "Jordan, I expected better from you. If you can't learn to work as a team, you're not going to get very far in life." Jordan felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment as the other students murmured among themselves. He clenched his fists under the desk, willing himself not to cry. He wanted to speak up, to explain that he had done all the work himself, but the words caught in his throat. Miss Henderson's sharp gaze seemed to dare him to protest, and he couldn't bring himself to meet her eyes. When Jordan got home that afternoon, Natalie immediately knew something was wrong. She listened patiently as Jordan recounted what had happened, her anger growing with each word. This wasn't just about Jordan anymore. It was about a teacher abusing her position of power and targeting a student who didn't deserve it. Natalie knew she couldn't stay silent any longer. That evening, Natalie sat down at her computer and began typing. She wrote a detailed email to the school principal, outlining everything that had happened since the beginning of the school year. She included dates, specific incidents, and even mentioned the meeting she had with Miss Henderson weeks earlier. By the time she finished, the email was several pages long, but Natalie didn't care. She was determined to make sure the school took her concerns seriously. The next morning, the email was sent, and Natalie waited anxiously for a response. She knew this could go one of two ways. Either the school would take action, or they would dismiss their concerns entirely. She prepared herself for both possibilities, knowing that she wouldn't stop fighting for her son no matter what. At school, Jordan noticed that Miss Henderson seemed more on edge than usual. She moved through the classroom with a forced cheerfulness, her smiles too wide and her tone too bright. Jordan couldn't help but wonder if his mom's email had something to do with it, though he didn't dare ask. The tension in the room was almost palpable, and even the other students seemed to sense that something was brewing. The day passed slowly, each minute dragging into the next. By the time the final bell rang, Jordan felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension. As he walked out of the classroom, he caught a glimpse of Miss Henderson standing at her desk, her expression unreadable. For a moment, their eyes met, and Jordan quickly looked away, hurrying out the door before she could say anything. Unbeknownst to Jordan, Natalie's email had sparked a chain reaction behind the scenes. The principal had called Miss Henderson into her office that morning, and the conversation had been tense. As the week went on, the tension continued to build. Jordan tried his best to stay under the radar, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen. Natalie, meanwhile, was preparing for whatever came next. She knew that standing up to someone like Miss Henderson wouldn't be easy, but she also knew that she couldn't back down, not when her son's well-being was on the line. The stage was set, the players in place, and the air was thick with anticipation. Whatever was coming, it was clear that the situation was far from over. All that remained was to see how it would unfold. The days following Natalie's email were marked by a quiet tension that seemed to ripple through the school. Miss Henderson's usual confidence appeared slightly cracked, but she carried on with a thin veneer of control, avoiding any direct confrontation with Jordan. For Jordan, however, things didn't feel any easier. While his teacher refrained from overt remarks or actions, there was an unmistakable chill in her demeanor toward him. It was like a wall had gone up, and even though he wanted to believe the situation was improving, deep down, he knew this wasn't over. One afternoon, as Jordan sat in the library trying to finish an essay for Miss Henderson's class, he'd overheard two teachers talking quietly in the next aisle. Their voices were low, but certain phrases carried through the otherwise silent room. The principal's watching her closely. One voice said, "If there's another complaint." The sentence trailed off, but Jordan's stomach dropped. They were clearly talking about Miss Henderson, and the idea that she might be in real trouble should have brought him some relief. Instead, it only made him more nervous. If Miss Henderson was under pressure, who knew what she might do next? At home, Natalie was keeping her own close watch on the situation. She had heard nothing back from the principal after sending her email, which left her with an unsettling feeling of uncertainty. She had no idea whether her concerns were being taken seriously or if they were being swept under the rug. But Natalie was nothing if not resourceful. She began reaching out quietly to other parents, testing the waters to see if anyone else had noticed unusual behavior from Miss Henderson. To her surprise, one of the parents she contacted shared a story that was eerily similar to Jordan's. The other parent, a woman named Carla, explained that her son had been in Miss Henderson's class the year before and had also struggled with her harsh teaching style. She singled him out all the time, Carla said during their phone call. "It got so bad that we had to request a transfer to another teacher. I didn't think much of it after that, but now that I hear what your son's going through, it makes me wonder if there's a pattern." Natalie felt a mix of anger and validation as Carla spoke. If Miss Henderson had a history of targeting students, then it wasn't just about Jordan. It was about holding her accountable for behavior that had likely affected many others. But Natalie also knew she needed to tread carefully. Confronting a problem like this wasn't just about standing up for her own son. It was about protecting future students from the same treatment. She and Carla agreed to stay in touch and to quietly gather more information from other parents. Back at school, the tension between Miss Henderson and Jordan continued to simmer just beneath the surface. Jordan kept his head down, trying to avoid drawing any unnecessary attention to himself, but Miss Henderson seemed to have developed a new tactic, making him invisible. During class discussions, she would call on nearly every student except Jordan, even when his hand was raised. Group activities were assigned with little thought to how they would affect him, and any work he turned in was met with lukewarm feedback at best. It was as if she had decided to erase him from her classroom without saying a word. The breaking point came during a parent-teacher conference night. Natalie arrived at the school prepared to address the ongoing issues head-on, but when she walked into Miss Henderson's classroom, she was greeted with a cold, professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The two women sat across from each other, the air between them charged with unspoken tension. "I understand you've had some concerns," Miss Henderson began, her tone clipped but polite. "I want to assure you that I've been doing everything I can to support Jordan in my class." Natalie raised an eyebrow, her hands folded neatly on the desk in front of her. "That's interesting," she replied, her voice calm but firm. Because from what Jordan's told me, it doesn't seem like he's receiving much support at all. In fact, it sounds like he's being ignored." Miss Henderson's smile faltered for just a moment before she regained her composure. "I'm sorry you feel that way," she said, her words carefully measured. "But I treat all my students fairly, and I believe it's important for them to learn independence." "Independence," Natalie repeated, her tone sharpening. "Is that what you call refusing to call on him in class? Or pairing him with students who won't contribute to group projects?" Miss Henderson's expression hardened, but before she could respond, there was a knock at the door. The principal stepped in, his presence immediately shifting the dynamic in the room. He greeted both women politely before taking a seat, his demeanor calm but authoritative. "I wanted to sit in on this meeting," he explained, glancing between Natalie and Miss Henderson. "Given the concerns that have been raised, I think it's important that we address them openly and find a resolution." For a brief moment, Natalie felt a flicker of hope. The principal's involvement could mean that her concerns were finally being taken seriously. But as the conversation unfolded, it became clear that Miss Henderson wasn't going to back down easily. She defended her teaching methods with calculated precision, twisting the narrative to make it seem as though any issues in the classroom were a result of Jordan's behavior rather than her own. Natalie refused to let her spin the story. She presented specific examples of Miss Henderson's behavior, backing them up with Jordan's experiences and the information she had gathered from other parents. The principal listened carefully, his expression neutral, but Natalie couldn't tell whether he was truly on her side or simply trying to mediate. The meeting ended without a clear resolution, leaving Natalie feeling both frustrated and determined. She knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but she also knew that she couldn't stop now, not when there was so much at stake. As she left the school that evening, her mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. She had already come this far, and she wasn't about to give up. Meanwhile, Miss Henderson sat alone in her classroom, her hands clenched tightly around the edges of her desk. The meeting had shaken her more than she cared to admit, and for the first time, she felt a twinge of doubt about her ability to maintain control. But that doubt quickly gave way to anger. In her mind, Natalie was the problem, not her. And if Natalie wanted a fight, Miss Henderson was more than ready to give her one. What neither of them realized was that this battle was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would change everything. The following week brought a whirlwind of events that neither Jordan nor Natalie could have anticipated. After the tense parent-teacher conference, the principal launched a quiet investigation into Miss Henderson's behavior, speaking with other teachers, students, and parents to get a clearer picture of the classroom dynamics. While the investigation was still ongoing, Miss Henderson seemed to double down, becoming increasingly rigid and defensive. Her outward demeanor remained professional, but there was an underlying sharpness in her actions that made it clear she felt cornered. Jordan, on the other hand, found himself caught in a storm he didn't ask to be a part of. Classmates began whispering about the drama, speculating about what might happen to Miss Henderson. Some even approached Jordan, offering quiet words of support or sharing their own stories of feeling unfairly treated by her. For the first time, Jordan realized he wasn't alone, and that knowledge gave him a small but important sense of strength. One morning, as the students filed into class, they were surprised to see a substitute teacher standing at the front of the room. Miss Henderson, they were told, had taken an unexpected leave of absence. The announcement was brief, and no further details were provided, but the atmosphere in the room shifted noticeably. Jordan felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. While her absence meant a temporary reprieve, it also left him wondering what was happening behind the scenes. At home, Natalie received an email from the principal requesting a follow-up meeting. The tone was neutral, but Natalie couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had happened. When she arrived at the school, she was escorted to the principal's office, where she found not only the principal, but also a district representative waiting for her. The district representative introduced herself and thanked Natalie for bringing her concerns to light. "We've reviewed the situation thoroughly," the representative explained. And we found enough evidence to take disciplinary action against Miss Henderson. She will not be returning to the classroom for the foreseeable future." Natalie felt a wave of relief wash over her. Finally, it seemed like justice was being served. But before she could fully process the news, the representative continued. "However, there's something else we discovered that I think you should be aware of." Natalie's heart sank as the representative handed her a folder containing several documents. Inside were records showing that Miss Henderson had a history of complaints stretching back years. The complaints ranged from inappropriate comments to outright favoritism and unfair treatment, many of which had been quietly dismissed or handled internally without significant consequences. It was clear that her behavior wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a troubling pattern that had gone unchecked for far too long. As Natalie read through the documents, a sense of anger and determination rose within her. While she was relieved that Miss Henderson would no longer be able to harm students, she couldn't ignore the systemic failures that had allowed her to remain in the classroom for so long. Natalie knew she couldn't stop here. She decided to take her findings to the school board, determined to ensure that meaningful changes were made to protect future students. Meanwhile, Miss Henderson's absence was the talk of the school. Rumors swirled about what had happened, but no one seemed to have the full story. Jordan tried to keep his head down, focusing on his work and adjusting to the substitute teacher's more supportive approach. For the first time in months, he began to feel a sense of peace and normalcy returning to his life. But just when it seemed like the storm had passed, an unexpected twist emerged. One evening, as Natalie was preparing dinner, she received a phone call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was hesitant but familiar. It was Miss Henderson. She sounded different, quieter, almost vulnerable. "I just wanted to apologize," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "for everything. I've had a lot of time to think, and I realize now that I was wrong. I let my own frustrations and biases cloud my judgment, and I took it out on your son. I'm truly sorry." Natalie was caught off guard. Of all the things she had expected, a heartfelt apology wasn't one of them. She listened quietly, her emotions a mix of skepticism and sympathy. While she appreciated the apology, she couldn't forget the pain and stress her son had endured. "Thank you for saying that," Natalie finally replied, her tone measured. "But an apology doesn't erase what happened. I hope you use this as an opportunity to reflect and do better, not just for Jordan, but for every student you might work with in the future." Miss Henderson seemed to take her words to heart. After the call ended, Natalie sat in silence, replaying the conversation in her mind. While she couldn't say for certain whether Miss Henderson would truly change, she felt a small sense of closure. She had fought for her son, for other students, and for what was right, and in the end, that was what mattered most. As the school year continued, Jordan thrived under the guidance of his new teacher. His confidence grew, and he began to fully embrace his potential. Natalie, too, found herself reflecting on the journey they had been through. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. And while the story of Miss Henderson might have ended, the lessons it taught them, about courage, perseverance, and the importance of standing up for what's right, would stay with them forever. In the days following Miss Henderson's apology, Natalie and Jordan began to settle back into their routines. But there was an undeniable sense that something had shifted for both of them. The weight that had hung over their household for so long had finally been lifted, replaced by a newfound sense of clarity and purpose. For Natalie, it was a reminder of the strength she had as a mother and an advocate. For Jordan, it was a lesson in resilience and the importance of never letting anyone diminish his worth. At school, the transition to the substitute teacher was smoother than expected. The substitute, Mr. Carter, was warm, approachable, and genuinely invested in the students' success. His classroom felt safe and welcoming, a stark contrast to what Jordan had experienced before. For the first time in months, Jordan found himself looking forward to going to school. He began participating more actively in class discussions, and his grades steadily improved. Mr. Carter even noticed Jordan's talent for creative writing and encouraged him to submit a short story for the school's literary magazine. Jordan hesitated at first, unsure of whether his work was good enough, but with Mr. Carter's support, he took the leap. When his story was published a few weeks later, it was a proud moment not just for Jordan, but for Natalie as well. Meanwhile, Natalie followed through on her promise to bring the larger issue to the school board's attention. Armed with the evidence she had gathered, she attended a public meeting and shared her family's experience. She didn't speak with anger or bitterness, but with determination and hope for change. Her words resonated with many of the parents in attendance, some of whom shared similar stories of their own. The school board members listened intently, and by the end of the meeting, they had pledged to review their policies and implement stricter guidelines to ensure accountability among teachers. True to their word, the district took action. They introduced new training programs focused on bias awareness, classroom management, and fostering positive student-teacher relationships. They also established a more transparent system for handling complaints, ensuring that issues were addressed promptly and fairly. While these changes couldn't undo the harm that had already been done, they were a step in the right direction, a step toward creating a better environment for all students. As the school year drew to a close, Natalie and Jordan reflected on how far they had come. What had started as a painful and isolating experience had ultimately brought them closer together and inspired meaningful change. Natalie often thought about the other parents and students who might be going through similar struggles, and she hoped their story would encourage them to speak up and advocate for themselves. One afternoon, as they were tidying up the house, Jordan found a box of old photographs and mementos in the attic. Inside was a picture of Natalie from her college days, standing proudly in front of a podium after delivering a speech. Jordan stared at the photo for a moment before turning to his mother. "You know, Mom," he said, a hint of admiration in his voice, "I think you're the bravest person I know." Natalie smiled, touched by his words. "I just did what any parent would do," she replied, "but you're the one who inspired me. Watching you handle everything with so much strength, it reminded me of why it's so important to stand up for what's right." Jordan nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Maybe one day I can help people too, like you did for me." "You already are," Natalie said, pulling him into a hug, "just by being yourself." The summer that followed was filled with moments of joy and growth. Jordan spent his days exploring new hobbies, from photography to learning how to play the guitar. He even attended a summer camp where he met other kids who shared his interests, forming friendships that he knew would last a lifetime. Natalie, meanwhile, found herself reconnecting with old friends and rediscovering passions she had set aside. She started volunteering at a local community center, helping organize workshops for parents and students. It was her way of giving back and ensuring that others had the resources and support they needed to navigate challenges of their own. As for Natalie, she continued to be a fierce advocate not just for her son, but for all children. Her involvement with the school district grew, and she became a trusted voice in her community. Parents often came to her for advice, and she was always ready to listen and offer support. She knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but she also knew that every step forward, no matter how small, was worth it. In the end, the experience that had once seemed like a nightmare became a turning point for both Natalie and Jordan. It reminded them of the importance of resilience, the strength of community, and the power of speaking up. And while their journey was far from over, they faced the future with hope and determination, knowing that together they could overcome anything.